Elara had always been a curious soul, drawn to the mysteries of the world around her. Growing up in a small, quaint village nestled at the edge of an ancient forest, she often heard tales of the Lycans, noble yet fearsome creatures who were said to protect the land but were rarely seen by human eyes. The villagers revered and feared them in equal measure, speaking of them in hushed tones, especially when night fell. One evening, as the full moon rose high in the sky, its silver light bathed the forest in an otherworldly glow. Elara, feeling an inexplicable pull, decided to take a walk deeper into the woods than she ever had before. The forest, usually teeming with life, was eerily quiet that night, as if holding its breath. Each step she took seemed to echo, and her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. As she reached a secluded clearing, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing tall and regal under the moonlight, was a figure unlike any she had ever seen. His presence was commanding, his form powerful yet graceful. He had the features of a man, strong jawline, high cheekbones, and piercing golden eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. But there was something unmistakably otherworldly about him. His aura was both intimidating and magnetic, drawing her in despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. This was Prince Kael, the elusive Lycan prince. He had been patrolling his lands, as was his duty, when he felt a strange, almost supernatural force guiding him to this very spot. His kind had always maintained a careful distance from humans, believing it was better for both species. But tonight, something was different. As his eyes met Elara's, he felt a jolt of recognition, as if their souls had been intertwined long before this moment. Elara's heart raced as she stared into Kael's eyes, unable to look away. She should have been afraid. After all, she was alone in the forest with a creature of legend. But instead of fear, she felt a deep, inexplicable connection, a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. It was as if her very being was responding to him, calling out to him in a language only their souls understood. Kael, too, was taken aback. He had seen many humans in his long life, but none had ever stirred his heart like this. Her wide, expressive eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and wonder, her beauty amplified by the moonlight. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated him. It was the strength and purity he sensed within her. In that moment, Kael knew he had found someone irreplaceable. But as much as they were drawn to each other, they both knew the dangers that lay ahead. The world they lived in was not kind to such bonds, and the path before them would be fraught with challenges. In the days following their first encounter, Elara found herself constantly thinking about the mysterious figure she had met in the woods. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of him, his golden eyes, his commanding presence, the way he had looked at her, as if seeing into the depths of her soul. She tried to push him from her thoughts, knowing it was foolish to dwell on a being from another world, but her heart refused to listen. Kael, too, was deeply affected by their meeting. He had always prided himself on his control and discipline, traits necessary for a leader of his kind. Yet, Elara had shaken that control to its core. He found himself returning to the clearing night after night, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, though he knew it was dangerous. His protective instincts, usually reserved for his people, now extended to this human girl, a girl who had somehow become the center of his thoughts. One evening, unable to resist the pull any longer, Elara ventured back into the woods. She had told no one of her encounter, fearing they would think her mad or, worse, forbid her from returning. As she neared the clearing, her heart pounded in anticipation. What if he wasn't there? Or worse, what if he was, and she had misread everything? But her worries dissipated the moment she saw him, standing in the same spot as before, as if he had been waiting for her. Their eyes met, and the bond between them grew stronger, more tangible. Neither spoke, yet they communicated more in that silence than they could have with words. Kael approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. He had rehearsed 1,000 things to say, but now that she was here, words failed him. Instead, he simply extended his hand. Elara hesitated for a brief moment, her mind battling with her heart, but then she placed her hand in his. The connection that sparked between them was undeniable, a surge of warmth that spread through both of them, binding them closer together. From that night on, they met regularly in the woods. Their conversations were sparse, but their connection deepened with each encounter. Kael shared stories of his world, the responsibilities he bore as a prince, and the constant struggle to protect his people. Elara, in turn, spoke of her life in the village, her dreams, and her longing for something more, something beyond the ordinary life expected of her. The more time they spent together, the more they realized how similar they were despite their vastly different worlds. Both carried the weight of expectations. Both felt isolated in their own ways, and both found solace in each other's presence. The bond between them was not just emotional. It was spiritual, a connection that transcended their physical forms. But even as their feelings grew, they both knew they were treading dangerous ground. The love that was blossoming between them was as beautiful as it was forbidden. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Elara and Kael grew stronger, but so did the challenges they faced. Elara's village, while peaceful on the surface, was rife with suspicion and fear of the unknown. The tales of Lycans were not just stories but warnings, and any association with them was strictly forbidden. Elara knew that if her people discovered her secret meetings with Kael, the consequences would be dire. Yet, despite the dangers, Elara couldn't stay away. Each time she saw Kael, her heart soared with a joy she had never known. She had always felt like something was missing in her life, a void she couldn't explain. But with Kael, that void was filled. She felt complete, as if she had finally found the other half of her soul. Kael, too, was struggling with his feelings. He had always been the stoic, dutiful prince, putting the needs of his people above his own desires. But Elara had changed him. She had awakened something within him that he hadn't known existed, a fierce, protective love that consumed him. He knew the risks of their relationship, but he couldn't bring himself to end it. The thought of losing her was unbearable. However, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on them both. They knew they couldn't keep their meetings a secret forever. The villagers were beginning to notice Elara's frequent absences, and Kael's own people were growing suspicious of his nightly excursions. The pressure was mounting, and the fear of discovery loomed over them like a dark cloud. One night, as they sat together in their secret clearing, Kael took Elara's hand and looked into her eyes, his expression somber. "Elara, we can't keep doing this. It's dangerous for both of us. If anyone finds out..." Elara's heart clenched at the thought of losing him. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't stay away from you, Kael. I've tried, but it's impossible. You're a part of me now." Kael's resolve wavered as he looked at her, seeing the tears glistening in her eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I feel the same, Elara, but we have to be careful. I can't bear the thought of anything happening to you." They held each other for a long time, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. They knew their love was forbidden, but it was also undeniable. It was a love that defied logic, a love that was both a gift and a curse. Despite their fears, Elara and Kael continued to meet in secret. The risk only seemed to make their bond stronger, their love more intense. They would steal moments together in the dead of night, away from prying eyes, in the heart of the forest where they felt safe. During these meetings, they shared everything: hopes, dreams, fears. Kael opened up to Elara in a way he never had with anyone else. He told her about the pressures of being a prince, the loneliness that came with it, and the constant threat of enemies who sought to harm his people. Elara listened with a sympathetic heart, offering him comfort and understanding. In return, Elara spoke of her own struggles. Her father's expectations for her to marry a wealthy suitor, the pressure to conform to the village's narrow view of the world, and her deep yearning for something more, something extraordinary. Kael admired her courage and determination, and he found himself falling deeper in love with her with each passing day. Their love was passionate, all-consuming, and yet tinged with sadness. They knew that their time together was limited, that sooner or later they would have to face the consequences of their forbidden love. But for now, they chose to live in the moment, to savor the time they had together. Kael often brought Elara small tokens of his affection: a rare flower from the deep forest, a smooth stone shaped by a river's current, a feather from a bird that only the Lycans knew. These gifts were more than just objects. They were symbols of the world he wanted to share with her, a world that was as beautiful as it was dangerous. One night, as they sat by a small fire, Kael took Elara's hand and traced the lines of her palm with his fingers. "Elara," he said softly, "I wish things were different. I wish I could be with you openly, without fear of what might happen." Elara looked into his eyes, seeing the pain and longing there. "I wish that too, Kael, but I don't care about the risks. I love you, and nothing will change that." Kael's heart swelled with love for her. "I love you too, Elara, more than I ever thought possible." They shared a tender kiss, the firelight casting their shadows on the trees around them. In that moment, they were the only two people in the world, their love a bright flame in the darkness. But even as they kissed, they both knew that their secret could not remain hidden forever. As the weeks went by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The villagers had become more suspicious of Elara's late-night excursions, and whispers began to spread. People noticed the changes in her, the way she seemed distant during the day, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. Her father, a stern man with a sharp eye, was the first to confront her. "Elara," he said one evening as they sat at the dinner table, "where do you go at night? I've noticed you sneaking out. This isn't like you." Elara's heart raced as she searched for an answer that wouldn't raise more suspicion. I just go for walks, father, to clear my mind." Her father's eyes narrowed. "Walks? At night? Alone? You know it's not safe. The forest is no place for a young woman after dark." Elara nodded, trying to appear contrite. "I know, father. I'll be more careful." But her father wasn't convinced. He knew his daughter too well. There was something she wasn't telling him, and he was determined to find out what it was. Meanwhile, Kael was facing his own challenges. His advisors had noticed his absences and were growing concerned. Rumors had started to circulate among his people, whispers that their prince was involved with a human, a dangerous liaison that could jeopardize the safety of the entire Lycan clan. That Kael's most trusted advisor, an elder Lycan named Thorn, confronted him one night. "Kael, you must end this. Whatever it is you have with this human, it cannot continue. Our people rely on you, and this relationship puts us all at risk." Kael's jaw tightened. "I know the risks, Thorn, but I cannot simply walk away from her. Elara means more to me than you can understand." Thorn sighed, his expression one of concern rather than anger. "I understand love, Kael, but I also understand duty. You are the prince, and your first responsibility is to your people." Kael nodded, knowing that Thorn was right, but the thought of leaving Elara was unbearable. He was trapped between his duty and his heart, and the weight of that burden was crushing him. As the days passed, the storm that had been building finally broke. One evening, as Elara was making her way to the clearing to meet Kael, she was followed. Her father, suspicious of her nightly disappearances, had decided to find out where she was going. When he saw her slip into the forest, he trailed her silently, staying in the shadows. When Elara reached the clearing, Kael was already there, waiting for her. They embraced, and as they did, her father stepped out from the trees, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "Elara," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Elara spun around, her heart plummeting as she saw her father standing there. Kael's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts flaring to life as he stepped in front of Elara, shielding her from her father's wrath. "This is not what it looks like, father," Elara began, but her father cut her off. "It is exactly what it looks like," he bellowed. "You've been sneaking off to meet this creature? Do you have any idea what you've done? The danger you've put us all in?" Kael's golden eyes glowed with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I would never harm Elara or anyone in your village," he said, his voice low and steady. "I love her." Her father's face twisted in fury. "Love? You're not capable of love. You're a Lycan, a beast, and I will not allow my daughter to be with you." Elara's heart broke at her father's words. She knew he was afraid, but she couldn't bear to see him like this, consumed by anger and fear. "Father, please," she pleaded. "Kael is not what you think. He's kind, and he's done nothing but protect me." But her father would not be swayed. "You will never see him again, Elara. I'll make sure of it. You're coming home with me, and this ends tonight." Torn between her love for Kael and her loyalty to her father, Elara was paralyzed with fear and indecision. She looked at Kael, her eyes filled with pain. Kael. Kael's heart ached at the sight of her distress, but he knew that forcing her to choose would only cause her more pain. He nodded slowly, his voice soft. "Go with your father, Elara. I don't want to see you hurt." Elara's eyes filled with tears as she stepped away from him, her heart breaking into pieces. She looked back at Kael one last time, her voice trembling. "I love you, Kael. And I love you." Kael replied, his voice thick with emotion. With that, Elara turned and followed her father back through the forest, each step feeling like a knife in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever happened, she would never forget the love she had found in the woods, under the light of the full moon. Kael watched her go, his heart heavy with sorrow. He knew that their love was not over, but that they were facing their darkest days yet. The bond between them was strong, but would it be strong enough to survive the trials that lay ahead? Only time would tell. After that fateful night in the forest, Elara's life was turned upside down. Her father, furious and frightened, kept her under constant watch, forbidding her from leaving the house, especially after dark. The once lively and spirited Elara now felt like a prisoner in her own home, her heart heavy with the pain of separation from Kael. The bond they had formed was undeniable, and the ache of their forced distance gnawed at her daily. Despite the restrictions, Elara's thoughts remained with Kael, and she often found herself staring out of her window, longing for just one more glimpse of him. She knew deep down that her love for Kael was worth any struggle, any sacrifice. But what she didn't realize was that a storm far darker than her father's anger was brewing on the horizon. One fateful evening, as the sky darkened with an approaching storm, Elara's father received a mysterious letter. The messenger, a hooded figure, delivered it with urgency, disappearing into the shadows as soon as it was handed over. The letter bore no signature, only a simple wax seal, a crescent moon. Her father's face grew pale as he read the contents, his hands trembling slightly. That night, Elara overheard her father and his closest advisors discussing the letter in hushed, urgent tones. She couldn't make out much, but the snippets she did catch, danger, attack, Lycan, sent chills down her spine. Her heart raced as she pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear more. Suddenly, her father's voice rose above the murmurs. "We must act quickly. I won't let them harm my daughter. The Lycans will pay for this." Elara's blood ran cold. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Had something happened to Kael? Had the Lycans somehow been drawn into a conflict with her village? Fear gripped her heart as she realized that whatever was happening, it involved Kael, and it wasn't good. The next morning, her worst fears were realized. Her father gathered a small group of trusted men and announced his departure for the forest. His face was a mask of determination and anger as he instructed Elara to stay inside and lock the doors. "I'll be back before nightfall," he said, his voice firm. "Do not leave this house, Elara, no matter what happens." Elara nodded, her stomach churning with worry. She watched her father and his men ride off into the forest, her heart heavy with dread. The hours dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. She paced the floor, wringing her hands, praying that her father would return safely, and that Kael was unharmed. But as the sun began to set, the storm clouds thickened, and the wind howled through the trees, bringing with it a sense of foreboding. Elara's heart raced as she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Rushing to the window, she peered out into the gathering darkness. Her father's men were returning, but something was wrong. The group was smaller than before, and the men who remained were bloodied and grim. Panic seized her as she realized her father was not among them. Elara threw open the door and ran out to meet them, her voice shaking with fear. "Where's my father? What happened?" One of the men, a close friend of her father's, dismounted, and approached her with a solemn expression. "Elara, there was an attack. We were ambushed in the forest. Your father, he didn't make it." Elara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her vision blurring as the words sank in. No, it can't be. He promised he'd come back." The man lowered his head, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Elara. We tried to save him, but there were too many of them. The Lycans, they were ruthless." Grief and anger surged through Elara, mingling into a maelstrom of emotions. Her father was dead, killed by the very beings she had come to love. The Lycans had taken everything from her: her father, her peace, and her chance at happiness with Kael. In that moment, her love for Kael was overshadowed by a burning need for revenge. She would find out who was responsible for her father's death, and they would pay. She would make sure of it. The days following her father's death were a blur of grief, anger, and confusion. Elara couldn't shake the image of her father lying cold and lifeless, the words of the men who returned with the news echoing in her mind. The Lycans, they were ruthless. The connection she had felt with Kael now seemed like a cruel twist of fate. How could she have fallen in love with one of them, the creatures who had taken her father from her? Elara's sorrow quickly turned to determination. She would find out the truth about her father's death, and she would make sure justice was served. The villagers, now aware of the tragedy, were all too eager to support her. Many had long harbored fears and suspicions about the Lycans, and this attack only confirmed their worst beliefs. They urged Elara to lead the charge against the Lycans, to protect their village from further harm. Fueled by her grief and the villagers' support, Elara threw herself into the hunt. She gathered information from anyone who might know something about the Lycans' movements, questioned the survivors of the ambush, and studied the old legends and stories in an attempt to understand her enemy. Her days were consumed with planning and strategizing, and her nights were filled with restless dreams of her father's death. But as she delved deeper into the mystery, a nagging doubt began to creep into her mind. The Lycans she had read about, the ones who were said to be vicious and bloodthirsty, didn't match the Kael she knew. Kael was noble, kind, and protective. He had always spoken of his duty to protect his people, not to harm others. Could it be possible that there was more to the story than what she had been told? Despite these doubts, Elara couldn't bring herself to reach out to Kael. The pain of losing her father was too fresh, the anger too raw. She couldn't face him, not yet. But she knew she had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One evening, as she was going through her father's belongings, Elara found a letter tucked away in a hidden compartment of his desk. The letter was addressed to her, written in her father's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read. "Dearest Elara, if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer with you. I have always known that there would come a time when I could no longer protect you, but I never imagined it would be so soon. My greatest regret is leaving you alone in this world. But I have one last request, one that I hope you will honor. There is someone I trust more than anyone else to watch over you. Someone who I believe will keep you safe even when I cannot. His name is Kael, and though he is a Lycan, he is a good man. He has been a guardian to our village for years, protecting us from threats both seen and unseen. I trust him with my life, and now I entrust him with yours. Please, Elara, do not let anger cloud your judgment. Seek the truth, and remember that not all Lycans are our enemies. Some, like Kael, are our allies. If anything should happen to me, I ask that you find Kael and let him protect you as he has always protected us. With all my love, Father." Elara's heart clenched as she read the letter. Her father had trusted Kael, believed in him even in his final moments. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Kael wasn't responsible for her father's death. If anything, he had been trying to protect her father and the village. But if Kael wasn't to blame, then who was? Who had orchestrated the attack that killed her father? And why? The questions swirled in her mind, and with them came a renewed sense of purpose. She would find out the truth, and she would make sure her father's killers were brought to justice. But first, she had to find Kael. Determined to uncover the truth, Elara set out to find Kael. She knew the risks. If the villagers discovered that she was meeting with a Lycan, they would turn against her. But she couldn't ignore her father's final request. She needed to see Kael, to hear his side of the story, and to figure out what really happened that night in the forest. Slipping away from the village under the cover of darkness, Elara made her way to the clearing where she and Kael had first met. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the night absent, as if the very woods were holding their breath. As she approached the clearing, her heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. When she arrived, the clearing was empty. For a moment, a pang of disappointment washed over her. But then she felt it, a presence, strong and familiar, watching her from the shadows. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat as Kael stepped into the moonlight. "Elara," he said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I didn't think you'd come." Elara's breath hitched at the sight of him. He looked as he always did, strong, protective, and yet there was a vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored her own. She took a step toward him, her heart heavy with the weight of all that had happened. "I had to," she replied, her voice trembling. "I needed to see you, to talk to you. Kael, my father. He's dead." Kael's expression hardened, and he closed the distance between them in a few long strides. "I know, Elara. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have stopped it." Elara searched his eyes, desperate for answers. "They said it was the Lycans, Kael, that your kind ambushed him in the forest. Is it true? Did you know about this?" Kael shook his head vehemently, his hands reaching out to grasp hers. "No, Elara. I swear to you, I had no part in that attack. The Lycans you speak of, they're not my people. There are factions within the Lycan community, ones that don't follow our laws or our ways. They're dangerous, rogue Lycans who seek power through violence." Elara's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. "Then who? Who would want to kill my father?" Kael's jaw clenched and his golden eyes flashed with anger. "There are those who wish to break the fragile peace between our worlds. Your father was a leader, someone who stood for unity between humans and Lycans. His death was meant to spark war, to turn your village against my people." Elara felt a cold chill run down her spine. "But why? Why would anyone want that?" Kael hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "There are old grudges, deep-seated hatred that has festered for generations. Some Lycans believe that humans are beneath us, that we should rule them, not live alongside them. And there are humans who believe that Lycans are monsters, incapable of peace. Both sides have those who would do anything to see the other destroyed." Elara's mind raced as she tried to piece everything together. The attack on her father, the growing tension in the village, it all made sense now. Someone was trying to manipulate them, to push them into a war that neither side truly wanted. "But Kael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if these rogue Lycans are behind this, how do we stop them? How do we prove your innocence and prevent the war they want?" Kael's grip on her hands tightened. "It's not going to be easy, Elara, but we can do it together. We need to find the ones responsible and expose them for what they are. We need to show both humans and Lycans that peace is still possible." Elara nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes, Kael, for my father, and for us." Kael's eyes softened as he looked at her, his voice filled with emotion. "I promised your father I would protect you, Elara. I intend to keep that promise, no matter what." Elara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to be weak now. "We have to be careful. The village is on edge, and if they find out I'm working with you..." Kael nodded, his expression serious. "I know. We'll have to move in the shadows, gather information quietly, and strike only when we're ready. But we'll need allies, both human and Lycan, who believe in what we're fighting for." Elara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the challenges ahead. "Then let's start tonight. Tell me everything you know, Kael. I want to help." Kael smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Elara's heart flutter despite everything. "You're braver than you know, Elara. Together, we'll find justice for your father, and we'll stop those who seek to tear our worlds apart." And so, under the cover of darkness, they began their plan to uncover the truth and bring peace to both their worlds. But as they worked together, the bond between them grew even stronger, fueled not only by their shared mission, but by the love that neither of them could deny. In the weeks that followed, Elara and Kael worked tirelessly to uncover the conspiracy that had led to her father's death. They met in secret, often late at night in the same forest clearing where they had first confessed their love. It was dangerous for both of them. Elara risked the wrath of her village, and Kael risked exposing himself to rogue Lycans who would see him as a traitor. But they knew that time was against them. Every day, the tension between the humans and Lycans grew, and the threat of war loomed ever closer. Kael had connections within the Lycan community, and through them, he was able to gather information about the rogue faction responsible for the attack. These Lycans were led by a brutal alpha named Darius, who believed that Lycans should dominate humans, not coexist with them. Darius and his followers had been planning the ambush for months, hoping to incite a conflict that would justify their violent ambitions. Elara, on the other hand, used her position in the village to gather information from the human side. She carefully questioned those who had been involved in the search parties and the skirmishes with the Lycans, piecing together details that confirmed Kael's suspicions. She also found allies among the villagers, people who had known her father and believed in the peaceful coexistence he had championed. One evening, as they met in the forest, Kael brought news that chilled Elara to the bone. Darius is planning another attack, Elara. This time, it's not just a small group. He's gathering his forces to strike at the heart of your village. Elara's heart raced. When? How much time do we have? Not long, Kael replied, his voice grim. A week, maybe less. He's planning to attack during the next full moon, when his Lycans will be at their strongest. Elara felt a surge of fear, but she pushed it down. We have to warn the village. We need to prepare them, and we need to find a way to stop Darius before it's too late. Kael nodded, but his expression was troubled. It's not just Darius we have to worry about. There are humans in your village, those who lost loved ones in the attack on your father, who are eager for revenge. If they find out about Darius's plans, they might take matters into their own hands, and that could spark the war we're trying to prevent. Elara clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Then we have to act fast. We need to gather our allies, both human and Lycan, and take the fight to Darius before he can carry out his plan. Kael agreed, and they began to lay out their strategy. They would use the element of surprise, striking at Darius's camp before he could launch his attack. But they knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed more allies, more people who believed in their cause. Over the next few days, Elara and Kael worked tirelessly to build their coalition. Elara reached out to the villagers who supported her father's ideals, convincing them that the only way to honor his memory was to prevent further bloodshed. Kael, meanwhile, sought out Lycans who were loyal to the idea of peace, Lycans who were willing to stand against Darius, even if it meant fighting their own kind. It was a difficult task, fraught with danger. More than once, they were nearly discovered by those who would oppose their efforts. But slowly, their numbers grew, and with it, their hope. As the full moon approached, Elara and Kael prepared for the battle that would determine the fate of their worlds. They knew that the odds were against them, but they also knew that they had no choice but to fight. For Elara, it was a fight for justice, for her father's memory, and for the love she had found with Kael. For Kael, it was a fight for his people, for peace, and for the future he wanted to build with Elara. The night of the full moon arrived, and with it, the moment of truth. Elara and Kael stood side by side, their allies gathered around them, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The forest was alive with the sounds of the Lycan pack gathering in the distance, their howls echoing through the trees. The time had come. As the full moon reached its zenith, casting an eerie glow over the forest, Elara and Kael led their allies into the heart of the Lycan territory. The air was thick with tension, the silence only broken by the distant howls of Darius's rogue pack. Every step they took brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation, closer to the moment that would decide the fate of both their worlds. Kael moved with the grace and stealth of a predator, his senses heightened by the moonlight. He could feel the presence of Darius's pack, their primal energy thrumming through the air. They were close, too close. He glanced at Elara, her face set with determination despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Her bravery in the face of such danger filled him with a fierce protectiveness, a resolve to see her safely through this night, no matter the cost. The group halted at the edge of a large clearing where Darius's forces had gathered. The rogue Lycans, numbering in the dozens, were an intimidating sight, massive creatures with gleaming fangs and fur bristling in the moonlight. Darius stood at the center, his presence commanding and fierce, radiating an aura of sheer power and malice. He was taller and more muscular than any other Lycan there, his eyes glowing with the intensity of a predator ready to strike. As the battle raged on, it became clear that Darius's forces were faltering. The combined strength of Kael's allies, both human and Lycan, was proving too much for the rogue pack. Lycan after Lycan fell under the relentless onslaught, and those who remained began to waver, their loyalty to Darius crumbling in the face of such overwhelming resistance. Seeing his forces faltering, Darius became even more desperate, his attacks on Kael growing more savage and erratic. But Kael, though battered and bleeding, held his ground, refusing to give Darius an inch. With a final, powerful strike, Kael managed to knock Darius off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Kael stood over his fallen adversary, his eyes blazing with determination. "This is over, Darius. Surrender, and I'll show you mercy." But Darius was too consumed by his own hatred and pride to accept defeat. With a snarl of rage, he lunged at Kael one last time, but Kael was ready. In a swift, decisive move, Kael struck, his claws finding their mark. Darius let out a howl of pain before collapsing, his body crumpling to the ground, lifeless. As the last echoes of the battle faded, the clearing fell silent. The remaining rogues, seeing their leader defeated, either fled into the night or surrendered, their will to fight broken. Elara and Kael, exhausted but victorious, stood together as the full moon bathed the clearing in a pale, ethereal light. Kael turned to Elara, his expression softening as he took her hand in his. "It's over, Elara. We did it." Elara looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief, sadness, and love. "We did," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "And now we can finally start to heal." In the days that followed the battle, the tension between humans and Lycans began to ease. Word of Darius's defeat spread quickly, and with it came the realization that peace was not only possible, but necessary for their survival. Kael and Elara worked together to rebuild trust between their peoples, fostering a fragile but hopeful alliance. Elara's grief for her father remained, but she found comfort in the knowledge that his death had not been in vain. Through her efforts and Kael's unwavering support, they had prevented a war and secured a future where humans and Lycans could coexist in peace. Months passed, and as time went on, the bond between Elara and Kael only grew stronger. They were united not only by their love, but by their shared vision of a better world. They married in a quiet ceremony attended by both human and Lycan friends, a symbol of the unity they had fought so hard to achieve. As the battle raged on, it became clear that Darius's forces were faltering. The combined strength of Kael's allies, both human and Lycan, was proving too much for the rogue pack. Lycan after Lycan fell under the relentless onslaught, and those who remained began to waver, their loyalty to Darius crumbling in the face of such overwhelming resistance. Seeing his forces faltering, Darius became even more desperate, his attacks on Kael growing more savage and erratic. But Kael, though battered and bleeding, held his ground, refusing to give Darius an inch. With a final, powerful strike, Kael managed to knock Darius off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Kael stood over his fallen adversary, his eyes blazing with determination. "This is over, Darius. Surrender, and I'll show you mercy." But Darius was too consumed by his own hatred and pride to accept defeat. With a snarl of rage, he lunged at Kael one last time, but Kael was ready. In a swift, decisive move, Kael struck, his claws finding their mark. Darius let out a howl of pain before collapsing, his body crumpling to the ground, lifeless. As the last echoes of the battle faded, the clearing fell silent. The remaining rogues, seeing their leader defeated, either fled into the night or surrendered, their will to fight broken. Elara and Kael, exhausted but victorious, stood together as the full moon bathed the clearing in a pale, ethereal light. Kael turned to Elara, his expression softening as he took her hand in his. "It's over, Elara. We did it." Elara looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief, sadness, and love. "We did," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "And now we can finally start to heal." In the days that followed the battle, the tension between humans and Lycans began to ease. Word of Darius's defeat spread quickly, and with it came the realization that peace was not only possible, but necessary for their survival. Kael and Elara worked together to rebuild trust between their peoples, fostering a fragile but hopeful alliance. Elara's grief for her father remained, but she found comfort in the knowledge that his death had not been in vain. Through her efforts and Kael's unwavering support, they had prevented a war and secured a future where humans and Lycans could coexist in peace. Months passed, and as time went on, the bond between Elara and Kael only grew stronger. They were united not only by their love, but by their shared vision of a better world. They married in a quiet ceremony attended by both human and Lycan friends, a symbol of the unity they had fought so hard to achieve. The following day, Kael met with Elara, his expression grim. "We're in more danger than we thought," he said, recounting what he had overheard at the meeting. "They're planning to target you, Elara. They know you're the key to keeping the peace." Elara's face paled, but she didn't falter. "Then we need to expose them. If we can bring their plans to light, we can turn the tables on them." Kael nodded, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "We have to be careful. They're watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. And if they sense that we're on to them..." "I know," Elara replied, her voice steady. "But we don't have a choice. We have to stop them before it's too late." They devised a plan to gather evidence against the council, to expose their treachery to both the villagers and the Lycan pack. But this was no simple task. The council was powerful, and their influence ran deep. Elara and Kael had to move carefully, trusting only those who had proven their loyalty. As they set their plan into motion, the tension in the village grew. The acts of sabotage became more frequent, more brazen, and the villagers grew increasingly restless. Kael's pack, too, was on edge, with some members beginning to doubt the wisdom of their alliance with the humans. It felt as though they were standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from falling into the abyss of war. The time came for Elara and Kael to make their move. They had gathered enough evidence, witness testimonies, intercepted messages, and even the names of the council members. But exposing the council would not be enough. They needed to strike at the heart of the conspiracy, to dismantle it before it could carry out its deadly plans. Elara and Kael organized a secret meeting with the village elders and the Lycan leaders who were still loyal to them. They presented their findings, laying out the council's treachery in stark detail. The room was filled with shock, anger, and, most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. The elders, both human and Lycan, realized that the only way to preserve the peace was to act decisively, to remove the cancer that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Together, they devised a plan to take down the council. It would require a coordinated effort, with human and Lycan forces working together to apprehend the conspirators before they could execute their plans. It was a risky endeavor, but it was their best chance to avert disaster. On the night of the full moon, when the Lycans were at their strongest, Elara and Kael led a combined force of villagers and Lycans into the heart of the forest, where the council was holding its final meeting. The night was dark and still, the air thick with anticipation as they approached the hidden clearing where the conspirators had gathered. As they moved into position, Kael caught Elara's gaze, his golden eyes filled with determination. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Elara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's finish this." At Kael's signal, their forces sprang into action, surrounding the clearing and cutting off any chance of escape. The council members, taken by surprise, scrambled to defend themselves, but they were no match for the combined strength of the human and Lycan forces. One by one, the conspirators were captured, their plans thwarted before they could come to fruition. Elara and Kael confronted the council's leader, a man who had once been a trusted advisor to her father. His betrayal stung, but Elara knew that she couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. "You tried to tear us apart," she said, her voice cold. "But you've failed. This ends now." The leader sneered, his eyes filled with defiance even as he was bound in chains. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning. There will always be those who see the truth, that humans and Lycans can never coexist. You'll never be able to stop what's coming." Kael stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "We've already stopped it, and we'll keep fighting to protect the peace, no matter what." With the council's defeat, the immediate threat was neutralized. But Elara and Kael knew that their work was far from over. The scars of the conflict would take time to heal, and there would always be those who sought to undermine their efforts. But they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. In the aftermath of the council's downfall, Elara and Kael focused on rebuilding the trust between their communities. The evidence they had gathered against the council was made public, and the villagers and Lycans who had been swayed by the conspirators' lies began to see the truth. Slowly but surely, the tension began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. Elara took on a more prominent role in the village, using her influence to advocate for greater cooperation between humans and Lycans. She worked closely with Kael and the other leaders to establish new laws that would protect both communities, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Kael, too, led his pack with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path to lasting peace would be long and difficult, but he was committed to seeing it through. He encouraged his people to embrace their alliance with the humans, fostering a sense of unity that had never before existed between the two races. Together, Elara and Kael established a council made up of both humans and Lycans, dedicated to maintaining the fragile peace they had fought so hard to achieve. This new council worked tirelessly to address the concerns and grievances of both communities, striving to build a future where their children could grow up without fear or prejudice. Despite their efforts, there were still moments of tension, times when old wounds threatened to reopen. But each time, Elara and Kael stood as a united front, reminding their people of the horrors they had faced under Darius and the conspirators. They reminded them of the strength that came from standing together, not apart. Years passed, and the bond between humans and Lycans grew stronger. Elara and Kael's love continued to blossom, uniting their people in ways that neither could have imagined. They became symbols of hope, proof that love and cooperation could overcome even the deepest divides. The village and the Lycan pack began to prosper, their collaboration bringing about new opportunities and innovations. The children of both races played together, learned together, and grew up without the prejudices that had once plagued their ancestors. They became the embodiment of the future that Elara and Kael had dreamed of, a future where humans and Lycans could live side by side in peace. Elara and Kael had children of their own, strong and wise beyond their years. These children inherited the best of both their parents, Elara's compassion and intelligence, and Kael's strength and sense of justice. They grew up in a world where they could be proud of both their human and Lycan heritage, knowing that they were the living proof of the peace their parents had fought to achieve. As the years went by, Elara and Kael watched with pride as their children took on leadership roles within the community, guiding the next generation with the same values that had brought their people together. The scars of the past began to fade, replaced by a new sense of purpose and unity. One day, as the sun set over the village, casting a golden light across the landscape. Elara and Kael stood together on a hill overlooking their home. The village was bustling with life, filled with the sounds of laughter and joy as humans and Lycans went about their daily lives. It was a sight that filled them with a deep sense of satisfaction. "We did it," Elara said softly, leaning into Kael's side. "We built the world we dreamed of." Kael wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Yes, we did, and it was worth every battle, every sacrifice." Elara smiled, her heart full as she gazed out at the future they had created. "Our children will never know the fear and hatred that once divided us. They'll grow up in a world where they can be proud of who they are, of who we are." Kael nodded, his golden eyes soft with affection as he looked down at her. "And they'll know that it was love that made it all possible." As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in twilight, Elara and Kael stood together, content in the knowledge that they had not only survived the trials of their past, but had thrived. They had proven that love could conquer even the darkest of days. And in doing so, they had built a legacy that would endure for generations to come. And so, they lived out the rest of their days in peace, surrounded by the family they had built and the community they had saved. Their love had not only changed their world, but had also created a new one, a world where humans and Lycans could finally live as one. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.